So let me just start by explaining what this decision is. And by the way, this is a new series on YouTube for the channel. It's a decision series where we talk about different decisions we could make and people weigh in on the comments. So I was testing around with render times, and it came to my conclusion that freestyle takes a really long time to render. For some of the turnarounds, doubled render times rendering with freestyle versus without freestyle. So the point of this discussion is to talk about cell shading versus what I'm going to call principal shading. It's not technically a type of shading in animation, principal shading, but you use the principal shader in Blender, which means you work with the metalness or specular workflow. So that's what I'm going to call it, principal shading. I'll show you some pictures here on the screen of what I mean. Principal shading on one side and cell shading on the other side. And basically, freestyle would be used in cell shading, and you kind of need to have it in cell shading so that way you can see what's going on with things like fingers or facial cheeks and stuff that would be difficult to make out with no line work. And freestyle is the line work program for Blender if you're not aware. So principal shading, it uses synthetically or I guess digitally created image textures of things such as normals and roughnesses and metalness, and of course the diffuse, and brings them together into something that looks like this. Now, one of the disadvantages of using it is it tends to cause longer render times. But in fact, for my rendering sample testing with it, and I did some pretty strenuous testing of it, I rendered this forest for about 10 seconds, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when it takes 3 hours, it is quite a bit. So I tested and it found out that it was in fact faster. Now, if we were to do a cell shaded background with freestyle lines, I'm thinking it would take less time, but that would look very unattractive, cell shading for background elements. Most animated productions that have cell shading for character with line work have 2D element backgrounds or 2D elements imposed on basic 3D shapes. And I don't see us being able to make a large investment in time into 2D elements. So I'm thinking the backgrounds will pretty much be 3D principal shaded elements or texture, maybe not as much texture painted, but texture painted and principal shaded 3D elements. So it will take a long time to render the backgrounds, but on top of rendering the characters with freestyle, and then the freestyle actually taking more time than the principal, it doesn't really make sense, other than the fact for the character creation process, it's a lot simpler creating a character with cell shading than it is creating a character with principal shading, because with principal shading you need to worry about UV and the UV map ending, or the two UV maps coming together in the same spot. So I'm thinking that it makes more sense if we go with principal shaded characters, even though it's a little bit more work on the character creation front. I think overall it will make a product that's more competitive as far as views go in this day and age with so much animation elements at fingertips of hobbyists. And since we're already doing the principled backgrounds and it takes less time to render the characters, it just makes sense. I'm still undecided, so that's part of the reason why I wanted to do this, because I am going to get started on that first scene of episode 1 of The Champion of Rome pretty soon. So I want to decide this before I start really getting into that. So yeah, let me know what you think down below.